There could not be a bigger topic to talk about, I believe, than the title of our panel, Drought and Other Challenges. How is Arizona going to meet future water demand? Quote, shortage is the new normal, unquote. And we have four esteemed experts here. We have Tom Bishotsky, who's the director of the Arizona Department of Water Resources. We have Ted Cook, general manager for the Central Arizona Project. Dave Roberts, associate general manager for Water Resources at Salt River Project, and Kevin Moran, who is senior director for Western Water Programs at the Environmental Defense Fund. And I'm going to be really interested in what Tom and Ted present, since it changes every day. And as Brady alluded, we did have an important Central Arizona Project board meeting yesterday. And so without delay, I am going to turn it over to them. I just want to note that I don't think we're going to have time for questions. And I've been told you've been given cards for questions. And so I would just say with the organizers, we'll figure out a way to get those questions to the speakers, but with only 45 minutes, we'll see if there is time. But I'm going to sit down there and I'm going to start giving them dirty looks if they start taking too long for their comments, so we can keep on schedule. So with that, Tom, I'm going to turn the mic over to you.
Ted Cook, General Manager of CAP, and I are going to do a little bit of a tag team, focusing on the issues that we are facing on the Colorado River. Brady gave a little bit of an overview of those issues. Ted and I will give a little bit more detail. Can we get our presentation teed up, please? Thank you. Ted and I will give a little bit more detail about what we're facing in terms of the risks and how we're trying to address those risks, the drought contingency plan, essentially. So we'll start with some background information. Grady showed some of the information about water use sectors. This is more general about where the water comes from in Arizona, and you can see 38% is Colorado River. In reality, it's about 40%. This number, 38%, reflects some of the conservation that Grady showed, the waters that we've kept in Lake Mead. We have 18% of our supplies that come from in-state rivers, so Salt and Verde River, Gila River, Little Colorado River, etc. 41%, we still use 41% of the groundwater statewide. And then 3% of our supplies come from permitted reclaimed water reuse. And I make the point of permitted because that's permitted through the Department of Environmental Quality. There's other reuse that doesn't require that permitting. And so the number's a little bit bigger than 3%. So some background information on the left, a map of the Colorado River Basin, including the part of the basin that goes down into Mexico. And if you see the dash hatched red lines up in the northern part of this map, and then a little bit further south, and then over the California side, showing where some of the water goes outside of the basin, but originates inside of the Colorado River Basin. So again, upper basin states, Utah, New Mexico, Wyoming, and Colorado. Lower basin states, Arizona, Nevada, California, and then Mexico. And I wanted to focus on those states because Grady's slide of the conservation showed conservation coming out of those three lower basin states, plus Mexico. Very critical that we have found collaborative ways to work with our partner states to move forward with better management schemes on the river. I walked in at the earlier part of Grady's speech when he talked about some of the conflict over the years. Fortunately, since about the year 2000 or so, we moved away from conflict and into a more collaborative nature to manage the river. And without that, we will not be successful. Yet, one of the key elements of the drought contingency plan, which Ted will talk about, is that it is a collaborative plan. We are sharing some of the burdens, even though Arizona legally has the junior priority. You can see the graphs or the pictures of Lake Powell and Lake Mead. They are less than half full. And even though they are very, very large reservoirs, there's still substantial water supplies in there, but less than half full is not good. So this graphic does reflect what's been happening at Lake Mead. Left side, going back to when it was essentially full in 1999, and you can see the blue line. The trend has been continuing downward, both because we have been in a drought, or perhaps it's the new normal due to climate change. Regardless, we're seeing less water than we have a historic long-term average, which is 14.8 million acre feet. We're seeing at least 1.5 million acre feet less than we've seen for the long-term average. You can see in 2011, we had an uptick, very wet year in the upper basin. We got 3 million acre feet, approximately more water than normally would flow from Lake Powell into Lake Mead, but then the downward trend continued. And you can see the red lines that go from left to right are the current shortage triggers in Lake Mead. The first one, that top line being at elevation 1075. And you can see that we have dipped below that line, but we've not had a shortage because of how the triggers work from a timing perspective. So we've seen the lake go below 1075 in the middle of the summer, but as long as the lake is projected to be above 1075 on January 1 of the following year, we do not have the shortage reductions. On the tail end of that line, you can see that we were hovering around 1075, and we've stayed above that 1075 for several years because of all the conservation efforts that have occurred. So again, this long-term decline is because of the drought and because of the structural deficit that Brady referred to. So very complicated graphs here, but we're trying to capture for you what is the risk of Lake Mead falling below elevation 1020, a point in time which there's only 22% full or supplies in Lake Mead, 5.7 million acre feet. And again, that's about half of the nut that has to be met in the lower basin in Mexico. So a very risky position to be in. You can fall very quickly from that point to a point where the lake could be completely dry. And part of that is that diagram of Lake Mead, that teacup diagram. You can see as you go further down in elevation, there's less capacity in the lake, so you fall faster. So quickly, on the left side, the full hydrology slide, the gray band at the bottom is what we thought the probabilities would be in 2007 when we put together the current shortage guideline criteria. That value was about 7% or so. Without the drought contingency plan, you can see the risk has gone up to about 25%. If we do the DCP, the blue line, we're back down to where we thought we would be when we put the guidelines together in 2007. And that expressly was the goal of the drought contingency plan, to get us back down to those single-digit probabilities we had in the mid-2000s. On the right side, being conservative water managers, we also are testing something called the stress test hydrology, the period from 1988 to 2015, where there's less water in the system than historically over the whole period of record, the 1906 to 2015 record. Again, gray band at the bottom, what we thought in the mid-2000s with the existing guidelines. The orange line, without the drought contingency plan, now we're way up over 40% risk of falling to this very unhealthy level. And then blue line, again, with the DCP, we get back down to much less risk. So the DCP definitely lowers our risk in different hydrologic scenarios to the point where we have a much better opportunity to deal with what's going on. I will say that under the current guidelines, we don't know what's going to happen if the lake gets to elevation 1020. there are no criteria for how big the reductions could be in the lower basin. So modeling that's a little bit outdated, probably at least a year old. In various hydrologic scenarios, you can see reductions to keep the lake at this level, anywhere from 1 million acre feet to 6 million acre feet with climate change. Those are scary numbers, 6 million acre feet. So obviously, if you take action sooner, you can avoid that draconian outcome. Again, that's partly what the drought contingency plan is all about. So then I'll do my WWF and tag Ted and move on.
And that's different than the FS, right, Kevin? Yes. So implementing the lower basin drought contingency plan in Arizona. Before we get into that, just to clarify, what is the drought contingency plan? This is the additional work that we need to do to bend the curve, to reduce those probabilities that Tom just showed on the last slide, from where we thought we would be when the last program was put into place, which was the 2007 guidelines. It was supposed to last for 20 years, and we're halfway into it, and we realized we have to do more, and that's because of this persistent drought and structural deficit, that the risk of going below these critical elevations in Lake Mead have increased dramatically over where we thought a decade ago. So we have to do something more. The 2007 guidelines specified shortages to Nevada and Arizona, and also the treaty with Mexico at the time. Mexico was taking shortages too, and they ranged between a 320,000 acre foot cut. It's not on this slide, I apologize. There's a column missing or something. 320,000 acre foot cut at elevation 1075, going to 480,000 acre feet cut at Tier 3 at elevation 1025. The numbers, oh, did I need to flip the slide?
They're catching up.
Oh, okay.
All right.
They're doing it up there for me. You can see under the drought contingency plan, lower basin drought contingency plan, there is an upper basin plan. We're not going to talk about that today. The shortage tiers increase to 512,000 acre feet at Tier 1, all the way to 720,000 acre feet in a Tier 2. Most of that comes out of the Central Arizona supply, which, as Tom said and Ray said earlier, is about 1.5 million acre feet. So it's a large chunk of the CAP supply. This is a sacrifice that we have to make to have a more sustainable lake, and that is 40% of Arizona's water supply. The fallacy that often happens when people look at what would happen under the 2007 guidelines, where it's between 300 and 400,000 acre, 480,000 acre feet, and the DCP, which goes up to between 500 and 720,000, it's more under the DCP. And of course, the only way to bend that curve and reduce the likelihood that the lake will continue to go down to these levels is to take less water out of it. That's how it works, basically. But the fallacy under both of those scenarios is that's as bad as it gets. We would only go down to 480,000 acre foot cut under the guidelines. Why would we want to do more? Well, we understand why we would want to do more, because it slows down the decline in the lake. But it can get worse than the number at the bottom. And that's what Tom was talking about a moment ago. If the lake continues to go down, something else has to be done. And that could be in the hands of the Secretary of the Interior to say we need to do 2 million acre feet next year of reductions in order to preserve the reliability of the lake. So there is an interstate drought contingency plan that has been worked on since 2015. Thereabouts. There was some work that happened before that, but in earnest about 2015. And then there is a drought contingency plan implementation within Arizona that we have to do. The next slide, there's lots of little numbers on here. I won't talk about every one, but you can find this on Tom's website, on my website. Shows all the contributors under the 2007 guidelines, and also the additive amounts under the drought contingency plan. Arizona, Nevada, and California. California does not have any legal obligation to participate in these reductions because they have a cedar priority in the lower Colorado River. But even they realize that continued declines in the lake threatens their supply too, senior or not. And so they're participating in this. The United States has an obligation and they do not have a supply of their own. But the United States has an obligation, and then under the minute, latest minute with Mexico that was executed last year, Mexico will take additional cuts along with the United States. They actually beat us to this and put in the treaty last year that they would do more contingent upon the United States doing more. So once we do that, that flips the switch on the additional cuts that Mexico will take. Arizona does take the most, and that's reflective of the fact that Arizona is junior. One thing I would point out to you, even though the goal of the DCP is not to permanently deal with the structural deficit, one of the reasons that it's so effective is that as the lake declines, the cuts go up. And by the time we get to 1030 or so, 1035, that's a second and third line from the bottom and all the way over at the right, the total reductions that we're taking among the lower basin states in Mexico is about equal to the structural deficit. So at that point, the lake will be in equilibrium just because of that. But that's before taking into effect continued poor hydrology and climate change in the upper basin. So there's more work to do. The minute we're done with this, we've got to start on something else. One of the difficulties with implementing the DCP within Arizona is that there's a priority system to water. Every drop of water, there's rights to water that already belongs to somebody. There's no like extra water sloshing around. Not everybody uses all of their water, and that's why somebody else can use it until the higher priority user grows into the use of their full entitlement. If we were to, and this is on the left, if we were to, you saw this graph before, Brady showed it, implement the DCP in Arizona according to priority, there would be very, very little, if any, that taken on the river, and most of it would go to CAP, because CAP is, for the most part, the lowest priority compared to the river. But within the CAP system, there are priorities too. And so what you see on the graph up there is that the other excess water is a term of art that we use for water that belongs to senior water rights holders, but they're not using, so it's available for other uses. Excess water goes primarily to the Central Arizona Groundwater Replenishment District that Grady was referring to before. Under priority, straight priority cut, CGRD water from this source would go away entirely, as would the Central Arizona Agricultural Pool. Grady was alluding to that as well, and maybe nick in a little bit to the next priority. It's called non-Indian ag priority, but it's not ag water that's being used by cities and tribes. So the fact that under a shortage in Arizona, the implementation of DCP, certain sectors would go away entirely, while others would be affected a little or not at all, doesn't seem to be equitable. It certainly is going from a full supply to a third less between 2019 and 2020 is a difficult pill to swallow. So one of the goals of the implementation of the Lower Basin Drought Contingency Plan in Arizona is to have a more equitable distribution of the pain. And let me just say that bearing in mind what the title of our segment here is the LBDCP is just a transition from having a full supply that probably those times will end next year to a lower supply that will become gradually lower over the next 7 or 8 years after that during the period of the 2007 guidelines, and then we'll have to do something next. And this may be the new normal of having a third or a half of the supply that we've been used to for the last couple of decades. So this is just a bridge to the future, and then we need to backfill that with other supplies like desalination and so forth. So how can we make things a little bit more equitable? Well, some of those higher priority water users, those that are shown on the slide up here, and maybe on the river, might be enticed for one reason or other, money, hit it again, okay, keep going. Okay, there we go, this is an animation. Might be induced to reduce or change the use of some of their water supply so that it could be available, at least temporarily, to lower priority water users. This is just an example. It is not this simple in real life. In June, Tom and I, even though we've been working on DCP in Arizona probably since 2016, started very much in earnest this year in June in this very auditorium. put together a steering committee to implement this program within Arizona. We've come up with this way more complicated and elaborate than what you see on the right there. Our goal was to have that work done by the Colorado River Water Users Association annual meeting. That's next week. We are not going to quite meet that goal, but we are very close to it. And the next milestone that is going to occur will be consideration by the Arizona State Legislature to authorize Arizona to sign on to the interstate deal. And we are going to be ready for that. We don't have everything worked out yet. There are lots of individual agreements that need to be written and signed and executed to get there. That will take place over the next several months, probably. We've heard a lot about this morning about these allusions to a very important CAP board meeting that happened this week. It was very important, but I don't want to minimize that at all, but it's just another brick in the wall of getting this all done. But what happened last week was a steering committee that Tom and I co-chaired met after nearly 2 months of not meeting, so we could do a lot of groundwork. Reviewed an implementation plan for DCP in Arizona. Yesterday, the CAP board voted to support the key elements of that plan. There's still some details, more than details, significant issues that need to be worked out, but Tom and I may have to reconvene our steering committee a few more times to get that done, but we're very close. I have a feeling now of inevitability, not that we don't care about the details, but we have so much momentum now, it's almost going to be difficult to mess it up, I think, at this point, even though there's a lot of work to do. No time to go ahead.
I just wanted to add that the CAP board stepped up to the plate and put CAP resources on the table. A key element that happened November 15th. Governor Ducey announced that he would be seeking $30 million for appropriations in his FY 2020 budget to put resources on the table. Philanthropic groups, Kevin might talk about this, have offered some of their resources. Cities, tribes, agriculture are all seemingly at this point talking about doing things, taking some pain, shifting how they do their business, etc. So it truly is a collective plan on the table right now, lots of moving parts. It's very equitable, it's very fair. Lots of people are taking pain, lots of people are going to have to change how they do business. But we are accomplishing what we hope to accomplish to some degree in that right-hand bar. But it is a very complicated situation with a lot of moving parts and a lot of agreements that still need to be put in place. And of course, we didn't mention this, but for the drought contingency plan between the states to become effective, the director of WR needs a resolution from the legislature to give me the authority to sign us onto that agreement. Obviously, I would not have the authority to sign onto an agreement that creates these huge additional shortages within Arizona, among other things. So the intra-Arizona agreement is really put together in a way to build support for me to stand up in front of the legislature and get that resolution passed and signed by the governor.
So I will just say one more thing to complete what Tom started here with the numbers. Last week, the governor and his put for $30 million, and also the NGOs led by the Walton Family Foundation for $8 million to fund a very important part of this program. I'll put in a plug for my board that kind of got that ball rolling November 15th in a special meeting that they had where they committed $60 million to create some of this conservation and 450,000 acre feet that could be used for mitigation to supply a piece of that bridge. So we've seen a lot of building of momentum, and it is very important that we don't forget that we're so excited about what we're accomplishing that there's still a lot of work to do and still some thorny things to work through. And I like to characterize those as if those things, if the things that we have remaining to do are easy, they'd be done by now. So the hardest stuff is always at the end. So we have to buck up and get back at it, even though we're already tired from everything that's happened. I need to pass the mic on and get this. Okay, so we're going to Dave Roberts.
Can you hear me? This is good? All right, very good. Good morning again. I'm Dave Roberts, and I am the Associate General Manager for Water Resources at Salt River Project. And I have some slides, good, I'm glad they're up there, and I am going to provide Salt River Project's perspective on the drought contingency plan. And I'm going to do that with a little bit of a history lesson, because as you will see, SRP has been down this road before. About 90 years ago, and you're going to see a few slides to help illustrate that as well. Brady talked a little bit about Salt River Project. I'm going to give you a little bit more perspective on that with a few slides coming up. This is Roosevelt Dam, and that's not a fake picture. We have had the Roosevelt Dam look like that at various times. It doesn't always look like that. Brady talked about the importance of dams and reservoirs and how that's led to the development of the Salt River Valley and the expansion of the city of Phoenix and the Phoenix metropolitan area. And that's very, very true. But the secret is not just having dams and reservoirs, it's how you manage them. That is so critical to ensuring a reliable and resilient water supply. It's how you manage those reservoirs. The DCP is all about managing reservoirs and managing that water supply in the reservoir. And I can't stress enough how important it is for Arizona to sign on to the Lower Basin Drought Contingency Plan. It is critical for us. Speaking for someone who has responsibility of managing 7 reservoirs and a water supply for the Phoenix metropolitan, a good part of the Phoenix metropolitan area, I can't stress enough how important that is. And so I'm hopeful that a lot of progress has been made over the last month or so on the mitigation or implementation plan for us to be able to, for the state of Arizona to sign on to the DCP. But it's critical for this state to do that because it's all about managing reservoirs. And you're going to see what happens when you don't manage reservoirs here in just a second. We'll move on to the next slide, please. I'm going to give you some perspective. Brady covered a little bit about the Salt River Project and the watersheds and the service areas, but I'm going to have a little bit prettier pictures here to show you that as well. This is a map showing the Salt and Verde and a little bit of the East Clear Creek watershed, which is a tributary of the Lower Colorado River. The Salt River Project gets its water supply from this area, the surface water supply. This is a 13,000 square mile area that feeds that area in the yellow, which is our water service territory. So that water service territory is about 350 square miles. So we have 13,000 square miles of watershed that feed an area of 350 square miles. So it's about 37 square miles per mile of area where we serve. Can I have the next slide, please? This is taking a little bit closer look at that water service territory. We serve, our service territory overlaps 10 valley cities, all the parts of 10 valley cities. The blue area is our electric service territory. You can see it extends out beyond where our water service territory is. That blue area is about 2,400 square miles. A good part of it is national forest land, so only about half of that is land that's developable. We have the next slide. This is shows our reservoir system. As I mentioned, we manage 7 dams and reservoirs. 4 of them are located on the Salt River, starting at the uppermost dam is Roosevelt Dam and all the way down to Stewart Mountain Dam. We also have 2 reservoirs on the Verde River, Horseshoe Dam and Bartlett Dam. And then a recent addition to our reservoir system is the C.C. Cragen Dam, which is located on East Clear Creek up on the Colorado River watershed. Combined capacity for all these reservoirs is about 2.3, a little over 2.3 billion acre feet. Can I have the next slide, please? So this is a slide that provides a little bit of perspective of our reservoir system. About 72% of our capacity of our reservoir system sits at Roosevelt Dam. Roosevelt Dam and Roosevelt Lake is Salt River Project's Lake Mead, okay? That is the barometer of our water supply, what's in Lake Mead. The rest of the reservoirs do not hold as much water as Lake Mead, obviously, or as Lake Roosevelt does. So that is the barometer of our water supply system. But I want you to remember that capacity at Roosevelt, 1.6 million acre feet we can store at Roosevelt. Okay? All right, let's take a look at the next slide. There's a lot going on in this slide. Grady talked about the variability of surface water supplies in the state of Arizona. And this slide highlights that variability, but it also includes a number of other things that I want to highlight as well. It shows the red line, the red horizontal line that you see there is the line of 650,000 acre feet. This shows runoff into our watershed from the late 1880s all the way through today, with the red line being the median inflow of 650,000 acre feet. So the green bars above the red line show when we get additional water off the watershed, and we are typically storing that water in our reservoirs. The green bars below the red line mean that we are not getting as much runoff, and we are pulling water out of our reservoir system. It also shows the various cycles of wet and dry periods that we have experienced from the late 1880s all the way through today as well. And you can see we have periods of wet years, or wet periods, and we have times when we are in dry periods as well. And you can see that over the last, much like on the Colorado River system, over the last 23 years, we've been in a fairly dry cycle. And you can see most of the bars from about 1995 to today are below the median. In fact, we had our poorest runoff year ever this past year. Now, you would think that we would be crashing our reservoir, but we are not. We still have over 1 million acre feet of water stored in our system. We're still at about 50% full, a little bit less than 50% full in our reservoir system, despite all of those bars where we're below median runoff. Now, the reason why we were able to do that is because we carry water over in storage for subsequent years. So when we capture those big runoff years, we don't empty our reservoir, we don't empty Roosevelt Lake just because we've got that water supply. We carefully manage that reservoir to make sure that we're carrying water over year to year. And to the extent that we don't have enough carryover storage, we draw upon other supplies as well. Now, it took us a while to figure this out. I'm going to show you the next slide here, and this is going to be a picture of Roosevelt Dam in November. On the left is Roosevelt Dam in November of 1928, and the picture on the right is Roosevelt Dam in July of 1929. Now, the amount of water in Roosevelt Lake in 1928 was about 40,000 acre feet. Now remember, our capacity at Roosevelt is about 1.6 million acre feet. At this time, it was about 1.3 million acre feet. We've added some capacity of that through the addition of capacity through the new conservation program. The picture on the right shows Roosevelt Lake, and we had 8,000 acre feet of water in Roosevelt at that time. Now, this was a very, very scary time for Salt River Project. Now, Roosevelt Dam was completed in 1911. And at that time, from 1911 through to this time, pretty much every year, we had an ample runoff supply into our reservoir system. And for much of the time, we treated Roosevelt sort of like what we've been doing at Lake Mead. We've been fulfilling the entire allocation of our water supply to our shareholders during that entire period with surface water and very little groundwater. At the time, we didn't have too many wells in our system, and most of those were drainage wells anyway. They varied, only a few of them actually provided surface water. And so or excuse me, groundwater for supply. So this is, so what happened during this period is that there was a lot of panic within the Salt River Valley during this period. Concerns over the fact that we're going to have to manage this reservoir a lot differently than what we have had to do in the past. And that's really what the DCP is about, is managing this reservoir, Lake Mead and Hoover Dam much differently than we have in the past. So this is what can happen if you don't manage your reservoir system. And so SRP and working with the shareholders of the Salt River Project began a program of developing alternative water supplies at the time. And if I could have the next slide. There was a lot of press about this during that period as well. And here are just some of the headlines that you will find in the Arizona Republican back in November of 1928 and during that period in the early 1929 as well. The one headline that I really like, that I really want to emphasize, is the one in the upper left there about big water problem is solved. And that's what we have here. We have a big water problem relative to the operation and management of Hoover Dam and Lake Mead. And I'm hoping we can get to solving it. If I could have the next slide just to summarize it, because I'm getting the 1 minute sign from Sharon. Just a few things here. First of all, wise use of our reservoir system is critical for us to build a resilient and reliable water supply. And the DCP does just that for Lake Mead. It's critical that the state, as I mentioned, pass DCP so we can be managing Hoover Dam and Lake Mead much differently than we have in the past. That will enable us to provide that reliable water supply. We do need alternative water supplies, and we do have some of those. We've been storing water underground, as Grady talked about, and as Tom and Ted have talked about as well. We need to draw upon that supply. Reclaimed water is a huge supply here in the valley and in Arizona as well, and we need to be able to take a look at that and use that supply as wisely as we can. And then there'll be a next bucket. People have been talking about next buckets of supply. We're going to have to be investigating what those might be to help supplement our water supplies in the state as well. Or we're going to run into a limit on just how much growth we're going to have in the state. And lastly, conservation is a key. Passing the Groundwater Management Act and pushing forward conservation programs in all sectors is critical, and we need to continue to do that. And we're all going to have to be able to work together in partnership as well. So with that, I will conclude. But again, I want to stress how important the DCP is, and I hope that we can get to the finish line, the goal line on the implementation program. Thank you.
Good morning. Kevin Moran, Senior Director of Environmental Defense Fund's Western Water Program. I want to add my strong endorsement for the Arizona DCP implementation plan, which is coming together. It's not completely done, as Ted and Tom indicated. But it is critically important for Arizona to be on board with the multi-state agreement to stabilize the river system and keep Lake Mead from falling to critically low levels. So I want to speak as the wrap-up here for this panel, specifically to your role as community leaders. I felt a lot better last night when I stopped thinking about providing answers this morning and really thought about questions. Questions that I think we all are going to be dealing with in the future. And so we need you. We need you as leaders of today and tomorrow on how Arizona secures water supplies for the long term while protecting other values. So you've heard about the grim hydrology. You've heard about the important work going on right now for the drought contingency plan. Let's stabilize the patient. But what you've also heard, with which I agree, is that the weight of scientific evidence and analysis is that we are in a new era. Not just drought. Drought is probably the wrong word. It's an era of aridification, meaning that we have to think about less supply from the big river system, from the big Colorado River, long-term. That is probably the prudent thing to do. Grady asked some really good questions. I'm going to suggest that maybe take one level down from those questions that he raised and suggest that maybe there are some right questions, or help you get to framing the right questions to ask of your water management, of your water resources. When I was at Cox Communications for 11 years, one of the things I remember from leadership training is one of the things you can do is ask really good questions. That's what good leaders do. So I want to suggest that figuring out what the right questions are is really important. I do want to say that I think we are in an era where the questions are harder than they were before. We're in higher order, more difficult questions. Not only because of the grim hydrology, but because a lot of the obvious sources of new supply have been tapped. So what do I mean by higher order, harder questions? I'll pose one. Brady talked about how do we find water for growth. I would suggest that that's a really important question. And I would suggest how we frame the work on that is really important. So I would ask it this way. How do we find the water for the next people that come to the Sun Corridor, to Central Arizona, without decimating the economic prospects of river counties and the health of the Colorado River mainstem? That's a higher order question in a way, right? Then can we find the money to build a ditch? It's a harder question. But I think that's what we have to take on as Arizona. And I think that's the kind of, we need you to help us figure out the solution. If that's the right question, if we agree that's the right question, we need you and others and our water leadership to answer it. One of the things that's happened with the drought contingency plan agreement, as you heard Ted and Tom outline, is less water is coming through the CAP canal for Central Arizona. Probably in 2020, about a third of what the total volume of what has come to Central Arizona will not be coming to Central Arizona. Now you're going to be hearing more about the Groundwater Management Act and that signature achievement of Arizona's water history, and our history is in community leadership. One of the core principles of the Groundwater Management Act, the active management areas, Phoenix and Tucson in particular, is safe yield. We have to find a way to be in balance and not completely deplete that fossil groundwater that Grady mentioned, that part of our heritage. That, our friends in the home building and development industry, was one of the critical achievements that allowed Arizona to grow and thrive since 1980. It provides predictability. It provides a signal to the nation and investors and the world that we have our water act together. That's what it did. One of the things it did. So the question I would pose, and here's that one of those subsidiary questions, right? Maybe a level down from where Grady was, which was really important. The next, maybe a question ought to be, if a third less Colorado River water is coming in, a lot of it went to storage. You heard, a lot of it went to groundwater replenishment. Where are we with safe yield long term? Do we need to improve and update the signature achievement of the Groundwater Management Act so that we stay in balance? I think that's a really important question. So I'm going to just pose one other question, or I'll bring into focus something else that Brady teed up. Rural groundwater. In an increasing number of Arizona communities, residents are realizing that the well on which they rely might not be reliable long term. Their homestead, their business, their livelihoods is at risk. So I think most of you are aware, but I just want to put it out there and acknowledge the reality that right now, in most of the geography of Arizona, groundwater pumping is not managed and limited in the way you might think it is. So folks are showing up at public meetings and asking of their elected leaders. They're saying, I've been on this well. My family was on this well 50 years ago. And now I don't know if it's going to provide the water for my family long term. So I would ask the question, what is the role of the gathering community and the state in providing solutions that respect and uphold the reasonable expectations and the homesteads and the livelihoods of rural Arizona? What's the state's role? What's the role of a county? And how do we move toward a place where there's greater water security, where we meet the reasonable expectations of people that are already there? How do we do it? So with that, I'll turn it back to our moderator and really appreciate your engagement and the role you're all playing in your organizations.
Join me in thanking you. I just have a minute or two of comments to say, and then I'll give you instructions about the break that's to occur. But I know it's difficult to really cover in any depth the depth of the issues that we're dealing with. And one of them that I noticed was mentioned quickly by Ted, I think, was the concept of a structural deficit. And the issue is we've been allocating more water than we've had available through the Colorado system. And we relied on a great amount of storage in Lake Mead. And you saw this in 1999, 2000, it was almost full. And we've been pulling on that storage. And going back to Brady's analogy of money, we've been pulling on the bank account, what's been in savings. But it's not an endless account that we can keep pulling from. And we don't want the whole system to crash, like happened in 1929. So that's what everybody here is trying to balance. And Kevin, I think, said that the questions are changing, whatever, and that just triggered in my mind, and I went to my phone to make sure I was going to say it right. One of the great experts of life, Yogi Berra, who said, the future ain't what it used to be. And that is really what we're dealing with an ever-changing situation here. And we do need all of your involvement, because these are tough decisions that decision makers, you're going to hear from members of the legislature and city councils and others have to make. And they need the support of an informed public. So even if your job is not directly related to water, every one of us, I say this, is a water stakeholder or water user, and we need an informed, educated public on this. And I'd also just note, Brady tried to kind of get to deny his water background. He's not an expert. Well, I'll just tell you, my training as a professional was in economics in New Jersey. When I was a grad student, the only time water was mentioned was when we were taking a drink. And so careers can take interesting twists and turns along the way, and I would encourage you not to be, hesitant to get a bit more immersed in water. So with that, I understand we're going to try to take a really short break. Sarah said 5 minutes, but I think it's humanly impossible for this size group to get out and back in 5 minutes. So I think we should say, really in 10 minutes, everybody get back, and the restrooms are across the lobby. So again, thank you all.